Welcome to the Morning Phillips series hosted today on YouTube. The Morning Phillips series, originally hosted at the Garage co-working space in Rapid City, South Dakota, was created to discuss philanthropy, civil society, and community. It is an opportunity to have a conversation with good people doing good things creatively and collaboratively. The format is a conversation, not a presentation. 2 tables, 2 chairs, 2 computers, and a community of interested people watching on their computers. Today, we are pleased to have with us a federal judge, legal scholar, and South Dakota resident. A special thanks to the Bush Foundation, the Numad Group, Rural Philanthropy Institute, and the Garage for hosting today's conversation. Thanks to all those who have joined us for over 60 conversations. Now, with all that, we are pleased to welcome Karen Schreier, United States District Court Judge for the District of South Dakota. Thanks, Karen, for joining us today. Really appreciate your time yesterday and the small group conversation we had on Zoom, and looking forward to this conversation. Thanks for making time and being a part of this.
Good morning, and thanks for inviting me.
Karen, let's just jump in and talk about these times that we're in with the pandemic, COVID-19. So how is that impacting you as it is impacting all of us? Will you talk a little bit about how that impacts you in your daily life, and then how that's impacting you presiding over the court?
It's really changed things for me. I was always someone that worked at the office and was there every day. Now I'm only there if I have court hearings that are scheduled. So I usually am home working about 2 to 3 days a week and in the courthouse 2 to 3 days. Our court hearings are dramatically different than they were before. As a federal judge dealing with sentencings and changes of plea, the rules did not allow people to appear virtually. So after COVID hit, there was a federal rule change that actually was approved by Congress, allowing defendants to consent to have their hearings done virtually. So pretty much since middle March, my hearings on a criminal case with either a sentencing or a change of plea, the defendant appears virtually on a big screen from the jail, usually if they're in custody, from home if they're at home. The 2 lawyers appear virtually on a big screen, on the same screen. And there can be other people that are watching, maybe family members that want to speak at a sentencing hearing. They're all appearing virtually or over the telephone. So the only people in the courtroom are me, a court reporter, and the deputy clerk, who's operating all of the mechanics of the hearing. We've had 2 trials since COVID. Everything in the courtroom has been changed. The jury now sits out in the area in the back where the spectators used to be, and they're all at least 6 feet apart. We moved the box where the witness sits clear to the back of the courtroom so that the jurors have a really good visual of the person when they're testifying. There's plexiglass around the witness stand, plexiglass around the podium where the attorneys are speaking from. We moved the tables where the attorneys sit so that they're now can turn one direction and look at the jury and the other direction and look at the judge. And we have plexiglass everywhere. So things are dramatically different. I wear a mask all of the time when I'm in the courtroom because I think it's important to protect anyone else that's in the courtroom. Everyone in the courthouse wears a mask. So it's dramatically different than things were back in February.
Do you think we'll go back to, or with Congress passing the law about video and showing it virtually, will we go back to the old way, or will that stay after COVID passes?
So the new federal rule and the law that was passed indicate that it only applies during a time of a national emergency, like the declaration of the pandemic.
Okay.
So it would require a different law for it to continue on after the emergency ends.
And if somebody doesn't have the ability to connect virtually, or you mentioned telephone, but if people have access problems, when I think of the rural state that we're in, how is that remedied? Are they provided technology to be able to have people speak for them?
So under the rule, video is supposed to be the primary means, but if that is not available, it does indicate that you can use telephone as a backup. We've kind of relied on the lawyers to make sure that anyone who may want to participate has the ability to do so. And I have had instances where the defendant has not consented to appear by video conference. And in those instances, we've had in-person hearings where everyone is masked. So it is like before, but we make sure everybody is spread out within the courtroom. We also have an overflow courtroom. We try to do only one large proceeding at a time so that we don't have too many people in the building at a particular time. So if we have more people than can be spaced out 6 feet apart, we put them into the overflow area, and then they can speak from there, and I'll see that by video. So for any spectators, could be in the overflow area.
Now, you were nominated in 1999, is that correct, by Bill Clinton? How does one become nominated, and how does that phone call go that you were you were told that you're being nominated or asked?
Well, to be nominated, it's usually the U.S. Senator who's of the same political party as the president and is the senior senator makes a recommendation to the president. And for me, it was Senator Daschle at the time. So you have to be a lawyer that has a good reputation as a lawyer, but also have some political connections in order to get noticed either by the senator or whoever the nominating person is that's sending your name forward to the president. And I was just lucky to have been involved in political matters before, so Senator Daschle knew me. I also had been President Clinton's co-chair of his campaign when he first ran in 1992, so he was already familiar with my background. I was very lucky that at the time that President Clinton was president, he thought it was really important to have a judiciary, in fact, all political appointments that looked like the country as a whole. He wanted to have white people, African American people, Native American people, men, women, people of all different backgrounds be political appointees. He had already appointed 2 white men to be federal judges, so I was the 3rd person that he nominated, and I think he was really interested in appointing a woman at that point. Luckily for me.
Well, I look forward to talking about the 19th Amendment and in a little bit. But before we go to that, can we talk a little bit about the federal judge and state judges and the difference between that, especially in our state?
So for a federal judge, we're a judge that has limited jurisdiction. State court judges have general jurisdiction, which means they have jurisdiction over almost everything. But federal judges are limited to what Congress has delegated to us. So on the criminal side, it's only violations of federal law. For us, that can be drug cases, felonies that happen on the Indian reservations, any cases dealing with mail or wire fraud, immigration matters. There are a number of gun offenses that come into federal court. Those are the main things that we would deal with here. On the civil side, our jurisdiction is limited to either a federal question dealing with something under the U.S. Constitution or a federal statute, or a matter that's called diversity jurisdiction, where the plaintiff and the defendant live in 2 different states and they're suing for more than $75,000. So our jurisdiction is really limited as compared to a state court. And our mix of cases here in South Dakota is really different than a lot of other states. We have a lot more criminal matters than most other federal courts deal with.
Will you talk a little bit about the advisory guidelines range? Because that comes up that sentencing is restricted in some ways, or seems that's my interpretation. And will you clarify that? And what are advisory guidelines, and what do they pertain to, and why do we have them?
So I'll start with why we have them first. Probably about 30 years ago, there was a concern that defendants were not being treated equally or the same, and that there was some discrimination in sentencing. The thought was that minorities were getting more severe sentences than white defendants, for instance. And that's where the whole concept of sentencing guidelines came up, that everybody should be treated the same. If you commit a drug offense in California, you should get a similar sentence in California as you do in South Dakota. And it shouldn't be based on geography or race or economic background. So that's why the guidelines were developed, and it ends up being a book that's about that thick that goes through every federal crime, and it tells you what the base sentence is that you should start with, and if there are things that make it more aggravating or things that make it less serious, then you should either add points or take points off based on certain factors, but that those same factors should apply nationwide. So when we do a sentence, we start out with determining what the advisory guideline range is under this book first. And then after you've determined that, under a U.S. Supreme Court that was handed down about 15 years ago, we were then able to look at each case individually and figure out whether we think the sentence should be higher or lower than the advisory guideline range. And that case is called Booker. So that's what the advisory guideline ranges are, but there's another factor that layers on top of that, which are mandatory minimum sentences. And those are sentences that the Congress has determined apply to certain types of cases, mostly drug cases and child pornography cases are two examples. And there Congress has said you cannot go below the sentence that Congress has determined. There are a couple of factors that allow you to go below, like if the defendant has cooperated, or if they meet the safety valve requirements, which means they're in a really low prior criminal history category, and then we can go lower than the advisory guideline range. But other than that, the court's hands are tied and we can't go below the minimum that Congress set.
What does the research say about the fairness of that, or the goal of that rule? What does that? What does the research say? Is it more fair today than 30 years ago?
I think there are still inequities that have developed over time. Excuse me. There are some things that are fairer than it was 30 years ago, but there are some things that are not. When Congress intervenes with mandatory minimum sentences, it really takes any discretionary power away from the court, so that you can't look at things that you normally would with sentencing as to why someone is an exception to what the general rule is. So sentencing is by far the hardest thing that I do as a judge. You're really making the decisions about the future of somebody's life, and it's very personal. It's very difficult to look somebody in the eye and tell them that they're going away to prison. But it's also not fair to just have a book and that applies to everybody.
Karen, you get to see society in a way that most people don't on a daily basis, and a deep dive in people's realities. What grounds you? What grounds you what's your backstop in this work?
You know, the thing that I try to do with every defendant that appears before me is really listen and read carefully about their background. Try to figure out what motivates them. And I try to have a personal conversation with every defendant as I sentence them, giving them suggestions on how to make sure that they don't get into trouble again in the future. Try to identify a couple of things that they've done really well in the past that they can build on, that they can use as their first steps out when they get out of custody, and then what they need to do to make sure they don't get into trouble again. And I've had multiple defendants that have written me thank you letters afterwards and have, when they've gotten out and they've talked about how they were able to take what I said and really get them started on the right foot, and that they're doing great now. And that's what is really encouraging, is when I get those letters.
Mm-hmm. What you were nominated with President Clinton, just as Ruth Bader Ginsburg was nominated by President Clinton. Would you discuss Justice Ginsburg's role in equality for women?
So her role really started as an attorney before she became a judge. I look at how she was able to identify issues that made things not so equal for women and figure out a strategy using litigation to try to make a level playing field for women, whether it was equal pay for equal work, not being discriminated against once you got into the workplace. And then she could articulate a strategy that men could understand who were deciding the case. A lot of women could easily understand what the issues were, but she had to explain it to men because they were the judges. They were the decision makers. Oftentimes she picked an issue and had a man as the plaintiff in her case because she knew that the male judges could more readily identify with the issues that that man was going through. But then those principles could be applied to women. So I think she single-handedly changed life for many of the women in this country, and has really helped women get to a point where we're much closer to an equal playing field with men. And she continued those skills on when she went on the Supreme Court, to be able to easily identify issues and explain them to the other male justices on the court so that she could get their votes.
And it's been talked about that she and the late Justice Scalia, who differed legally in legal opinions, please correct me, very different in how they looked at legal issues. But they were best of friends, and they could have their opinions and have intellectual conversations about those and have civil discourse, be examples of civil discourse. It seems as though that's much more difficult today.
I think Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia both are people that were very intellectual, and they strove for being able to express their opinions as clearly as possible, and thought it was important to have a good, respectful conversation between two different ideologies. I read somewhere that Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia would share their opinions with each other before issuing them, so they could both edit each other's works and try to make them both stronger. And I just find that such an incredible bond, that people from two such diverse backgrounds could be that respectful of each other. But I think that's something that's really important for all of us as we're trying to have a better society that we live in. We need to listen to each other and learn from each other and respectfully share our opinions with each other so that we can all improve where we live.
How does the court play a part of that effort, especially when we talk about and think about politics and the branches of our government. What's the role of the court here in helping that occur?
You know, one thing that I think most judges really try to do is make sure that our opinions are written respectfully, that we're not snarky, we're not overly critical in our work. We try to write in a very even tone so that you can kind of keep the temperature of things down a little bit. So I think that's one thing that's important. But the role of the courts is really, we're there to resolve disputes. We're not there to be a mediator or to try to resolve everything in the world. It's just that one dispute that's before us in a case. Sometimes we'll use mediation as a method of resolution, but if the parties can't agree, we decide. One side wins, one side loses. It isn't usually something that's in the middle between the two of them. But that's really what our role is limited to, is just resolving disputes that come before us.
In order to have civil discourse, men, women, Black, brown, Native American, white have to view each other with respect. One of the things, our initial conversations was about the women's right to vote in South Dakota. And from you, I learned that it took 50 years for our state of South Dakota to vote to allow women the right to vote. And that was 2 years ahead of the federal government. Would you discuss the women's right to vote in South Dakota and how it was fought for in our state and brought national figures to our state 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago?
So our struggle started out shortly after the Civil War, and we got the right to vote right at the end of World War I. So you think about what a long time period that is, that women in this state and in Dakota Territory worked to try to get the right to vote. We were really lucky to have some of the national leaders come out to South Dakota because they identified the Western states as areas where they thought it was more likely that states would authorize the right to vote. South Dakota was looking for trying to add more women here. We didn't have a very large population, and most of the population that was here were male. So I think part of the thinking was if we had the right to vote, it might attract more women to move out here. In addition to that, they needed workers. You couldn't be an employee at the county courthouse unless you were able to vote. You couldn't hold a lot of jobs unless you were able to vote. So that was part of why I think the effort started here to try to get the right to vote. One of the things I learned in doing research was that Susan B. Anthony came to South Dakota twice, and she spent over 7 months here working with the local people to try to get the right to vote. And you think about the time period when she came, it was back in the early, actually the end of the 1800s. We didn't have interstates at that point. You couldn't fly from where she lived out here to Dakota Territory. At the time that she was here, people were still traveling by buggy with horses, and she campaigned across the entire state. To get to western South Dakota, you'd have to go through Indian country. So you'd go down to Nebraska, take a train across Nebraska, and then come up to the Black Hills where there were some white settlements that she was trying to contact at that point. But I think about the effort of working for 50 years to try to get the right to vote. I give up on projects now if I can't get it done in 6 months. I just can't imagine the tenacity of those women to keep working. One of the last leaders in South Dakota was a woman whose husband had passed away. He had been the Attorney General in South Dakota, and she worked for the last 10 years with 3 young kids and finally got our legislator and governor to support granting the right to vote, and we were the 15th state to finally approve women getting the right to vote.
And this was passed through the representatives a number of times. Am I correct? And vetoed by the governor a number of times early on, but yet persistence, the right thing to do, and a heck of a lot of hard work kept bringing up. What have you learned about why it was vetoed or that it didn't pass earlier? Anything that came up when you looked at that? Why it took 50 years?
So initially, when we were part of Dakota Territory, they tried to have it approved for Dakota Territory as a whole. And the fourth time that they voted on it, it passed both houses. And then Governor Pierce ended up vetoing the bill. So then they tried to get it into our Constitution when we were first becoming a state, but both the Democrats and the Republicans opposed that. Then it went on a statewide ballot to be added as an amendment to our state constitution, and there were 6 statewide votes. It failed every time until it finally passed in 1918. The biggest hurdles as to why people were opposed to it were primarily Germans, who were afraid that if it passed, women would take away their right to drink and the right to sell alcohol. And then also there was just general opposition from some men that thought that women's roles would change, that they no longer would want to be at home taking care of the men, taking care of the children, taking care of the home. And there were some women that were concerned about the fact that they didn't want their roles to change. And you think about it, it was only men that were able to vote on the issue. And I'm sure from their perspective, they had power. They were able to make all of the decisions, and nobody ever wants to give up the power that they have or share it with other people. So I think it was kind of a combination of all of those things as to why it took so long for women to get the right to vote.
What's the image in your mind when you think of these 50 years after researching? Is there an image of the Capitol that you think of, or of Susan B. Anthony, or in a train? What comes to mind, and why?
So there's one story that I read where the women filled the Capitol building. They were having a debate in the House of Representatives, and there were just women hanging from the rafters. And I just have a vision of them wearing their white with purple and yellow, because those were the suffrage colors. And it said the debate went on for just all night. And the story in the Pierre newspaper the next day was that there were a lot of men at home that night waiting for their wives to come and fix their meals. But the women were all at the Capitol building, anxiously seeing if this was going to pass. And when I was a page in the state Senate back in 1973, the Equal Rights Amendment came before the state Senate. And I happened to be there, and I saw the halls of the state Senate just filled with women in the galleries. So I have a really vivid picture of what it would have been like when they were there trying to get the right to vote.
Well, the right to vote for women and other minority groups had been long established. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. Why was that necessary, and why is it still significant?
So even though women got the right to vote in 1920 and the 19th Amendment passed, there were still a lot of minority women that were disenfranchised and were not able to vote. Native American women were addressed separately with the Indian Civil Rights Bill. African American women were still being subjected to poll taxes, taking tests before they could be registered to vote, just generally being disenfranchised. So the Voting Rights Act was finally passed and able to eliminate a lot of things that prohibited or precluded African American and other minority people from being able to vote. the Voting Rights Act, still until a couple of years ago when the Supreme Court cut back on the powers under the Voting Rights Act, really was continuing to protect the rights of minorities so that they could vote openly and freely. There are still issues that confront people, whether it's the way that districts are drawn through redistricting, either packing minorities into a district or spreading them out so thinly that they don't have any voting power. It can include things like changing polling places, reducing the number of polling places, reducing the hours that polling places are open, changing the ability to do early voting or absentee voting, requirements that can be placed on voters as to what documents they need to bring with them to show proof of identity. So there are a whole lot of ways that voting can still be impacted, and reasons why the courts and the Voting Rights Act are still involved in voting issues.
I think I have two questions that are about Susan B. What do you think Susan B. Anthony would think? One, what academic grade do you think she would give South Dakota and the country today?
Oh, that's a hard question. So I think that she would really want to make sure that voting was available to everyone, of all backgrounds, and as easy as possible. I think that although at the time that women got the right to vote, she would have been aware that it really only affected white women, and that minority women didn't get the same rights as white women at that time. I think that had she lived for longer, she would have pushed eventually to include everyone. At least that's what I hope. So I think that she would be concerned now that we're not doing more to just make voting available and as easy as possible for everyone. So she'd probably be at a C, maybe.
Just moments before, Susan B. Anthony obviously believed in discourse. What do you imagine she would say about the fact moments before we got online, the president has said he refuses to debate because it's virtual?
So what would she say about that?
Mm-hmm. Or another person in history that's been so that has so important in the United States history.
Well, generally, I think Susan B. Anthony would be in favor of any public discussion of any issue, and to use whatever medium possible. But I think, so I'll leave it at that.
What do you think today's right to vote effort that will have people 100 years from now saying, I wouldn't be here but for? Is there an issue?
I'm not able to identify what that issue is right now, but I look at all of the changes that have happened during my lifetime, and there are lots of things that I think when you live through something, sometimes you don't even identify it as an issue or a problem. And there are some people that are able to identify what those issues are, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for instance. And I just look forward to them coming forward.
You had mentioned that without the right for women to vote, you wouldn't have this position. Will you take another step along that thinking, and what else has been instrumental in your life to bring yourself to this position besides hard work and the opportunity or the equal voting and standing in society?
So the reason I wouldn't have this position if women didn't have the right to vote is because it also gave them the right to hold public office. So until women got the right to vote, there could not be a female judge. So I really thank Susan B. Anthony and all the other women that worked so that I can have this position. I think another thing that's been really instrumental in my life was the passage of Title IX. Title IX allowed women to participate in sports equally to men's participation in sports in school. And it passed while I was in high school. I was a junior in high school at the time. And before that, all we had was intramural sports. And after it passed, my junior year, they added track. But living in the country, I wasn't able to participate because I just didn't have a ride. I found somebody who lived a little bit further out of town than me that was also wanting to do track. So my senior year, I participated in track. And participating in sports allows you to develop so many skills. You learn how to work as a team. You learn how to be a leader. You learn how to do things independently, but that really help out everybody else on your team. It gives you so many skills that you don't have if you aren't participating in sports. It also opens up doors for scholarships for women to go on to college. Just huge stepping stones that women didn't have before that. So for me, Title IX was really a life changer. I was always really smart in school, but being a smart girl doesn't make you a lot of friends. But being good in sports, that's a huge thing. So it gives you a lot more confidence than you would have had otherwise. And Title IX for me was just a really great thing that happened for women.
After high school, you left South Dakota for college. You went to St. Louis. Will you talk a bit about the moving away, college, law school, and then coming back?
So my mom was originally from St. Louis, and she had 2 sisters, and I had 25 first cousins that lived in St. Louis. But I didn't know them very well. We would usually visit them for about 1 week every summer, and that was the extent of my knowing them. So when it came time for college, I thought, that'd be a great time to get to meet the other side of the family. So I went to St. Louis U and then stayed there for law school. The other thing it did for me was I grew up on a farm. We were about 5 miles out of town. So I knew my brothers and sisters really well, but didn't really have a lot of time to socialize with others. And I didn't know what being in a big city was like. So I wanted some time in a big city to see what that lifestyle would be like. And I knew really well how to bale hay, feed the cattle, pull weeds in the bean field, all of the farm skills that farm kids get. My mother's side of the family was in boating. They owned excursion boats in St. Louis. So I was able to work part-time on the weekends on the excursion boats and really learn the lifestyle of the other side of my family. So it really was something that I thought would help more well-round me as a person. And then I realized I loved South Dakota and came back after graduating.
And you practiced law in West River, right?
I practiced law in Sioux Falls. And then when I became a judge, my first 10 years were in Rapid City. And then now I've been back in Sioux Falls for 11 years.
Did you have a mentor? Is there somebody that you considered a mentor? If so,
So when I first started practicing law, one of my law partners, Tom Wilka, is who I'd say was my initial mentor. He really kind of took me under his wing, got me involved in a lot of community activities in Sioux Falls, and taught me how to be a good lawyer. So he would be my first mentor. I've only appeared before one female judge in my entire career, and that's Judy Meyer Henry. She was a state court judge when I first started and then went on the Supreme Court later. And I would consider her to be like my female mentor here. And my last mentor would be Janet Reno. When I became U.S. Attorney, she was the Attorney General of the United States, and she and I became pretty close during that time period. And I just really admired the way that she was so unflappable all of the time. And towards the end of my term as U.S. Attorney, I was meeting with her at least once a month, sometimes twice a month, and she became my mentor at that point.
what's the best piece of advice that you've received?
I would say that you just have to take advantages of any opportunities that come your way. You know, for a lot of us, you kind of get into a comfort zone and you just live day by day. But you've got to be willing to take a risk if an opportunity comes and see where it takes your life. So that's the advice that I would give.
What are you currently reading that's non-legal?
I just finished The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson. It's about Churchill during World War II and really identifies how to be a leader during difficult times. And I'd highly recommend it.
Will you take us, can we talk again about being a judge over these years, and what are some of the most, what have you learned most from a case that you presided over? What's been something that, is there a case that stands out to you that you would share this morning, and why?
So probably the most significant case that I presided over was a Voting Rights Act case, and the name of it is Bone Shirt. It was an allegation that when redistricting happened, that they packed all of the Native Americans from Pine Ridge and Rosebud into one legislative district. The district was about 90% Native American. And by doing that, the allegation was that it diluted the voting rights strength of Native Americans, because they could have been in two districts where they each had about 55 to 60%. And then they could have elected 2 senators and 4 representatives instead of 1 senator and 2 representatives. And as part of that case, I had to do what's called a jingles analysis, where you look at whether there's been a pattern or a history of discrimination against Native American people. So I went back to Dakota Territory Times and brought it up to the present and wrote about 100-page opinion outlining all of the official discrimination that had occurred towards Native Americans in South Dakota. And for me, I grew up in Flandreau, which is right by the Flandreau Indian Reservation. So a large number of my classmates were Native Americans. But I didn't know about any of this history. History of state laws that had been passed that didn't allow Native Americans to run for office, participate in water districts, just every broad concept you could think of. I learned that up until the mid-1950s, we had a state law that precluded a Native American and white person from being married to each other. I told one of my Native American friends about this law, and she just looked at me and she said, well, that explains why my parents weren't married when I was born. They got married a couple of years later, and that was after the law had been repealed. But I thought, I've lived in this state my whole life. I did not know about any of these acts that had happened. So for me personally, it was an incredible education to document all of that in one opinion so that it's accessible for anyone to read and understand. I felt really serves the interests of South Dakota to have all of that available for anyone who's interested. Found that there had been a history of discrimination towards Native American people, and found that the redistricting was invalid, and then split it up into 2 districts.
Karen, why do you think we're missing that in the education of our, in the schooling of in South Dakota, that history?
I don't know why. There's a lot of things that aren't discussed in schools. Discrimination towards African American people oftentimes isn't discussed in very much detail. History about discrimination towards Native Americans isn't discussed in much detail. I think part of it is we like to live in like a rosy atmosphere where we don't look back or acknowledge bad things that have happened in the past. But I think the only way that we can understand and learn how people feel is to be able to know what has happened.
Karen, where would we go to find that opinion? Is it online?
It is. It's available, I know, through Westlaw, which is the legal research entity. It's available through the court system. All of our documents are on something called PACER, where the public has access.
Free to the public?
I think there's a small fee of like 5 cents a page.
Okay. We'll try to post something on social media with a link to it. So when you look ahead 3, 10 years from now, what do you see? We're in this interesting, it's an overused word at this point. We're in this time. Where are we in 3 years? Where are we in 10 years? As a state, just as a country, world, what do you see?
It's really hard to look ahead right now because I think back a year ago, I would never predict where we're at right now. It wouldn't be anywhere on my radar. And I think because of that, it's so much harder to predict where we're going to be a year from now, 3 years from now. I don't know. I think that there are a lot of changes that have happened that are going to remain in effect. I don't think people are going to travel for work as much as they did in the past. I think there'll be many more Zoom meetings than we ever dreamed of before. But I also think people are really yearning for a personal connection. And I talked to my law clerks, and they always thought working from home would be great. They hate it. I mean, they really wish they could get back to being in the office. So I think there will be some changes, but I really can't predict at all what it's going to be like a year or 3 years from now.
Can women who have the right to vote still be disenfranchised when it comes to actually voting?
Everybody can be disenfranchised, whether it's women, men, minorities, everyone. I think we all as citizens have to make sure that we make it as easy to vote for people as possible. Because the more people that participate, the more our government reflects the country as a whole. So we need to be aware of any changes that are made that make it more difficult for people to vote. And I really hope that right now they're looking for poll watcher or for poll people to work at the polls, because a lot of the people that previously worked at the polls are afraid during the pandemic to go there. A lot of people are older. So I hope the next generation steps up and goes to be poll workers, because a lot of people want to vote in person, and we need to have places that are convenient for everyone to be able to go and exercise their right to vote. But that means we have to have poll workers.
Does democracy work if we have no compromise? Or do the courts ensure that there will be compromise in the long run?
So the court's role is not to make sure that there's compromise. So it really has to be done within the legislative and the executive branches. And I think that for democracy to work as fully as possible, people need to compromise. They need to listen to each other. They need to listen respectfully and figure out a way to move forward together.
Because when you hear a case and then you turn around and write a 100-page opinion, that's based on...
So it's based on the facts that were presented in that one case and the law that exists at that time. So it's based on decisions that the Supreme Court has issued before. For me, the Circuit Court of Appeals has issued before. And the facts, as I've determined, based on the evidence presented. But it only deals with that one issue that's before me.
What should all residents know? What should all residents of South Dakota know about South Dakota, in your mind, and about the United States?
So I hope that everybody that lives in South Dakota realizes how really lucky they are to live in such a beautiful state. I think a lot of us get isolated in our own little area, but if you go out and travel across the state, it is really gorgeous. And I think that within the United States, we all need to remember that we are a country made up of the Native Americans who were here initially and immigrants. Everyone other than the Native Americans came here. Their families came here from somewhere else originally. And we're just that big melting pot that we all need to work together to make this place a great place to live.
Karen, thank you for your words and time today. It's wonderful to begin the day like this. Really appreciate you being able to spend this morning and yesterday with us. At this time, due to COVID-19, we were unable to share a gift from the Black Hills Susie Kappa Art Center. Instead, we'll be making a donation in your name to Susie Kappa Art Center, a small token of appreciation. All those joining us online, please fill out the survey in the chat box. Also, Morning Philip was mentioned on Monday in the Washington Post. And thanks to everybody who's been a part of Morning Philip over the last 5 years and making it what it is. There'll be a link on Facebook for that article as well. Karen, thanks so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.
Have a great day.